Okay, well, it's just about afternoon, so good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for your interest in UCD Architecture and for attending online. What I'm going to try and do in the next 15 minutes is just to give you a sense of what architecture is about, and then I suppose specifically what it is like to study architecture at UCD. And I suppose if I was to think about how to sum up the profession of architecture, it's about imagining and realizing worlds. So the idea that you're given a situation, a set of needs, let's say, that people have, which might range from anything from needing more room in their house to needing a new office building, to needing a new stadium, to needing a new library. You have to imagine that world that they want into existence. And then you have to realize it, you have to build it. And then your job is done, if you like, and that new piece of the world comes into life and serves hopefully people's needs and makes their lives better. So you're involved at every stage in the career in this process of taking on people's problems, taking on people's needs, trying to shape built space which will serve their needs. And it's a process, so therefore, that's kind of endlessly varied, and it takes a long time to move from the inception of a project right through to the detailed development of the design, and then right through the period of construction and so on. But also the feeling at the end of it is that you've actually done something that's going to be there, hopefully for a long time, and that is really making people's lives better. The other thing to say about it, I suppose, is that it's a creative act. That whole thing of responding to needs, identifying the characteristics of a place where you're designing something for, trying to understand where the people are coming from, your clients and so on, and somehow synthesizing all of that into a piece of design for a piece of building is an inherently creative act. So, but at the same time, it's a creative act that's operates within the constraints of a given situation. In other words, it's not just for its own sake, it serves a purpose. So a sort of structured creativity, I suppose, lies at the heart of the discipline. So if you have an appetite for that, I think for that idea of being involved in that kind of concerted, structured creativity, then architecture could be for you. In UCD, we've been teaching architecture for a long time. The course is over 100 years old. It was established in 1911. It gets the highest number of first preferences among students leaving school. It's listed in the top 50 European architecture schools. And I suppose also importantly, you're going to be taught by practitioners, by people who are operating at the forefront of practice nationally and internationally. And you're also going to be taught by people who are operating at the forefront of research in various aspects of architecture. At the core of our thinking as well is an understanding that architecture is an international discipline, that it really doesn't know any boundaries. In the course of your studies, you're going to be learning about architecture from all over the world, and increasingly the reach of what we want to teach about and understand is really global, including lessons from architecture going on in China and India, in Africa, South America. So our horizons are always broad, and that's reflected in the course, because we would, over the course of your studies, you're going to be making a number of field trips, typically to European cities or regions. You're also going to have the opportunity to study abroad. We have a very active international study abroad scheme with partners around Europe, indeed, but also in the US, in Asia, and Australia. And something over 70% of our students will spend their semester abroad. And of course, that the obverse of that is also true, that we have a lot of international students coming into our program. Most of that activity happening in year 4 of the program. So that feeling, but that's also because, I suppose, once you have a degree in architecture, really you're licensed and enabled to practice and to join the profession anywhere in the world. That's certainly the case for UCD, because almost unique among architecture programs, we have a triple accreditation. So we're accredited by the RAI, the Irish accrediting body, which gives you effectively accreditation across Europe. We're accredited by the RIBA, the British accrediting body, which gives you accreditation in Britain, but also in large parts of the Commonwealth. And we, since 2017, also have substantial equivalency accreditation with NAB, which is the US-based accrediting body, which in turn gives you access to other areas, including China. So those accreditations, the recognition, if you like, of the quality of the degree that you would come out of UCD with is really important in terms of giving you a kind of passport to travel and to practice wherever you find yourself. And that international profile is reflected too, I guess, in people who have taught in our school, who have come through our school, and who have gone and have found great success, I suppose, on the international stage. Architects like Sheila O'Donnell and John Toomey, winners of the very prestigious RIBA Gold Medal in 2015, making buildings. Increasingly, this is the case for architects in Ireland, that they're making buildings around the world. In this case, a student centre for the LSE, the London School of Economics in London. And John and Sheila at the moment working on projects even further afield. This is another of their projects, the Lyric Theatre in Belfast. And I suppose in showing you these projects, I'm also showing you the character and quality of the work that's going on in Irish architecture at the moment. I think it's fair to say that the profession is enjoying a higher profile and a higher level of appreciation than might have been the case until the recent past. Other alumni of ours and adjunct professors, Shelley McNamara and Yvonne Farrell, who also won the RIBA Gold Medal this year, and then went on also to win the Pritzker Prize, which is the US equivalent, probably the most prestigious prize worldwide in architecture. So quite a year for them this year is proving. And they also, I suppose, are practicing and building around the world. This is a really important building for them and for the Bocconi University in Milan, which won the World Building of the Year in 2008. It's a major campus building in Lima in Peru for a technical university there. This is a building in Toulouse, which they've just recently completed, major university building. And this is the building that they're hoping to build in Dublin, up on Parnell Square, the Dublin Central Library, a very exciting project. Equally, of course, they were involved. They were the curators of the Venice Biennale, a very famous international exhibition of architecture in 2018. So I suppose I'm just showing you those to say that architecture in Ireland, and UCD architecture particularly, has this kind of international reach and enjoys an international reputation. This is where we're based at the moment. This is Richview campus, and indeed there's a building on the bottom left there by Grafton Architects, the Research Institute. So we're based in a campus, almost like a mini campus, which is just connected about 10 minutes walk to the main campus. Steph might say something about that when he talks in a few minutes. And the core really of our experience is in the studios within those buildings. The studio forms the core of your education experience. Now, having shown you Richview, I should say that come early 2024, we're due to move into the building you see on the bottom left of your screen there, the Centre for Creativity, part of a new piece of campus building development that's happening starting next year. And that building will provide state-of-the-art accommodation in terms of studios, workshops, other kinds of teaching spaces. Very exciting for us to be moving into there, right at the heart, really at the gateway to the campus. And we're looking forward to inhabiting these studios with the great views over the bay and the kind of connection back to the city. At the moment, the studios are also very important places for us. It looks like I'm sitting in one right now, but I'm not actually. Of course, I'm sitting at home. But in fact, our studios are still being used and occupied even during lockdown, because they're such an important part of the educational experience. So something like certainly well over half of your time will be spent in these studio settings. And I suppose the important thing is you're working on your project, you're working on your design project, but you're working in tandem with others, and sometimes in groups with others. And always you're learning from your peers, from those who are in the class with you, as much as you're learning from those who are teaching you, who are largely in the design studio, architects in practice. And it's characterized, I suppose, the learning. You're learning by doing. So right from the start, from first year, you're going to be given these sorts of little design problems that I've mentioned at the start of this talk. And you're going to be asked to propose a project which can answer the particular brief, as it's called. And what's interesting, of course, is that everybody's approach will be slightly different. No two projects will be exactly the same. And yet all of those projects are potentially valid and potentially of high quality. In other words, there's never one single way of making architecture. There's never one single approach. And some people are more driven by ideas, technical ideas, let's say. Some people are more driven by ideas about environment. Some people are more driven by ideas about society, social concerns. Some people are more driven by aesthetics. So all of those approaches are equally valid, and all of those interests, if you like, can equally well feed into a design process. As well as the studio, we have a very extensive workshop, which you see on the right here, where you're making models, you're making mock-ups, you're learning about different materials, you're learning about different building processes. And again, that idea of how buildings are made and how things are put together, and the sort of practical aspect of it, that it is in fact a sort of messy physical business, that's never far away, if you like, in terms of your training and your understanding of architecture. So the structure of your education over what would be 5 years to get to a full master's level qualification, which would then entitle you to move into practice. The structure is that in year one, it's really about principles, it's about foundations, it's about opening up your perspective on architecture, on the design process, and then on the history of the subject, on how architecture operates in terms of environment, on the technology, the construction of architecture, and on the sort of structures, like the idea that architecture has to actually stand up, of course. It has structural forces at work in it. So there's a subject in structures, which is part of your program as well. If year one is foundational, then years 2 and 3 are about refining and developing your knowledge. Same kind of process applies. You're in a studio, you're undertaking design projects, but as your knowledge builds, as your capacity grows, as your skills grow, those problems become more complex, sometimes larger in scale, sometimes more complex in terms of the conditions that you're trying to address or the mix of uses you're trying to accommodate, and your designs will grow in complexity to meet that. In year 4, we see that as an opportunity to expand your horizons, as we say, and in part that's through this opportunity to take a semester abroad, which we would see as being an important part, I guess, of your experience, learning how architecture is taught in a different culture, experiencing different cities, different environments. And then year 5 is really a sort of capstone year where there's a major piece of written research, and then there's also a major design thesis. And I'm going to point you toward just in the end of this talk towards where you might have a look at some of that work. And so the sort of the rhythm of the education is very much centered around you developing your design work through various media, through the various techniques of drawing and model making and digital work that we will teach you, and then presenting it back to your peers, to your tutors, your teachers, and then coming back, refining it, taking in feedback, refining, bringing it back again. So it's an iterative process through over and over again. You're refining and developing your work. And as you do that, obviously you're refining and developing the skills that you bring to bear in terms of model making, in terms of drawing of various kinds. And so it goes on through the years. I suppose if we were talking about particular characteristics of UCD, there is a strong emphasis on making models, large-scale pieces. There is a sort of close attention to the practice and almost the craft of architecture. And that's something that I think characterizes a lot of our teaching. Our year sizes, typically we take in around about 60, maybe 65 students. The gender balance is pretty much 50-50, and obviously the groups are becoming increasingly diverse. you know, students, international students, students from different backgrounds. And that's great, actually, in terms of just the different perspectives that are brought to bear on any given design problem. I'm just going to flip very quickly because I think Steph will probably cover some of this. But in first year, a lot of our emphasis is also on skills and on group work. Now, some of this not quite possible at the moment. Obviously, our first year students are working quite a lot in studio, but they're working in smaller groups. This is a project that we typically would run in first year, whereby the students work in groups to design and make tables. And those tables are then built in the workshop, assembled, and then they become, the idea of each table is that it can accommodate the group for a dinner sometimes in slightly unlikely configurations, sometimes in more traditional form. And that's the end of our first semester. So again, maybe pointing to the idea that it is quite a social course in the sense of you're going to spend a lot of time with your year group, with other years in the school. So there is a very strong sense of community. And as I mentioned before, a sense of learning from each other. Just very quickly in stage 2 and 3, a lot more, I suppose, a sort of an expanding of capacity and expanding of horizons, very importantly. And again, unfortunately, not possible right at the moment, but we're hoping that we will very quickly get back to the business of making field trips where studying architecture past and present, and actually understanding how to observe, how to sketch, how to make notes, how to understand any given environment in which you find yourself. These are very, very important aspects of the architects, and then more, let's say, measured surveys, more careful engagement with an environment in which you find yourself. These are all, as I say, very important aspects of how architects operate. Sometimes typically architects are operating in contexts which are already built to some extent, have kind of buildings of different vintages, are a particular kind of landscape and a particular kind of climate. So the understanding of the given environment in which you find yourself and in which you're going to operate, I think, is probably increasingly important to the discipline, particularly as we kind of understand that the responsibility in terms of carbon emissions and so on, and in terms of climate change. Architecture has to be really at the forefront of change in that regard. The construction industry is one of the major contributors in terms of carbon emissions. And so there's a huge sea change, I would say, underway at the moment in terms of architecture, how architecture builds and thinks about. But again, maybe just to finish and to reiterate that this setting that I'm notionally sitting in, of the studio, is really the cockpit of your educational experience. And unlike a lot of what you're doing probably in second level education at the moment, and unlike a lot of third level courses, as I say, our emphasis is on you learn by doing. In a way, we invite you from the outset to act as if you are an architect. You're given a design problem. You've got to work towards producing a piece of design. And through the process of doing that, year on year, you acquire the skills, you build your knowledge base, and you become capable, of working as an architect. It's a very exciting course for that reason. It's a lot of work. It can take long hours, but it's work where you're being creative and you're being imaginative and you're developing your own ideas. So that brings with it, I think, a certain kind of satisfaction.
Okay, perfect. So just, to get into it, my name is Steph. I am 19. I'm currently second year here studying architecture in UCD. I'm sorry you guys can't actually come and visit, the facility in Richley, because it's quite an experience to actually be there, and I think it could really inform your decision. So I suppose in light of that, my duty today is really to sort of capture the essence of what it's really like to study architecture in Richley from a student point of view. So what is architecture and why did I decide to study it? I think one common misconception that people have about architecture, or architecture students really, is that we just kind of stare at buildings all day, and we study buildings. And I suppose in a way that's kind of true. We do study buildings, but I think it's important to note that a building is really much more than like much more than like its walls and a roof. Like, a building has a human element, and that's ultimately what you're designing for. So to design a building, you have to understand people. And as a result, like when you're studying architecture, you end up looking far outside just the pools of knowledge that exist within architecture. You know, for instance, like recently I was doing some reading for the project that I'm currently working on in studio about gender roles and how our architecture and how our built environment can actually serve to reinforce gender roles that we're otherwise trying to deconstruct. So I think that just kind of shows that studying architecture gives you a great deal of freedom to really exercise your interests beyond just the built environment. Like you might enjoy looking at buildings, you might enjoy looking at architecture on Instagram or whatever, but actually studying architecture is more than just studying buildings. And that's really the reason why I decided to study architecture, because you know my interests were really all over the place. Like when I was in sixth year, I had such a hard time trying to figure out, trying to come up with an idea of what I wanted to do after school. Like I was interested, just to give you an overview, like I was interested in studying philosophy and history. I was interested in languages. I was good at maths in school, so like part of me was also thinking about engineering. And I suppose like architecture sort of acts as this grand intersection between art and science. And I mean, like your interests don't have to be the same as mine. Like you can definitely be more artistic and have no interest in maths, or you can be the opposite sense. Like when I studied DCG and physics and applied maths for that evening cert. Like I'd never really done an art class, but equally there are people who are the complete opposite that did ordinary level maths, did art, didn't do DCG, and are definitely more artistic and creatively driven. And I think like yeah, it's just important to note that like you don't really need to have any skills beforehand. Like what you need to be is curious, and if you're curious and you're an inquisitive person, I think you'll really thrive in this course. So as Hugh was saying, like a big part of architecture is, of course, studio. So the way the course is structured is you have 30 credits per semester, and 15 credits are given over to this design studio module. So half of your time, realistically, is spent on studio. So this here is the first year studio. It's in the basement in Richview, which I mean you can take from that what you will. But you'll end up spending a lot of time here doing work, and you'll end up spending a lot of time here with your classmates doing work. So you know, studio is it can be broken down into really two main facets. There's ideation and production, and ideation is basically working through your designs, and generally that happens through sketch and overlay. So like what happens is you start drawing out your ideas, and then you take tracing paper and you work over them, and you draw over them, and you resolve different aspects of your design. And generally you work through that for a bit, and then you'll move over to the production phase, which is essentially putting together technical drawings. And generally, you know, that does take a bit of time. But like as I said, you're in the studio with other people. You're not working alone, generally under normal circumstances. So it's I suppose really social in that aspect. The main aim of first year is really to like develop your skills. So like as I was saying, you don't need to have technical drawing skills. You don't need to have skills in art. Like the main aim of first year is to build all of that. And another aspect is it's to help you come to grips or get to grips and understand scale. So in first semester, you do this by working through a series of sort of mini projects that work through all of the different types of scales that architects generally work with, from abstract, like our first, the first brief that we were given in first year was to make an abstract model. And I mean, I was pretty lost with that, but like you were saying, you're learning by doing. Like you essentially just jump straight into the task, and you learn from the outcomes of what you produce, you know. And from the abstract, you work through all of the different design scales, so like 1 to 200 and 1 to 500. Like I actually have a couple of models here that I was working on recently, like these little models you work with as well as sketching and stuff. So it's all like you're constantly making things, you're constantly drawing, and you're constantly expressing. Um, so you essentially, like I was, you were working through the scales. You get to detail scale, and then ultimately first semester, first year, as Hugh was saying, culminates in making a piece of furniture at the human scale, at the scale of 1-to-1. And I think like this is really a highlight of first year, I suppose, not just because like you're actually producing something, but it's really interesting to see how your ideas and how these things that you're drawing on paper sort of manifest themselves actually in the real world, in this physical thing, as something that you can interact with. And like this project, like it's 50, you work in the studio coming up with your design, and then you spend a week working away in the building lab making this table, and you do that like in a group setting, so you don't do that by yourself. So like coming back to this, it's studio, it's incredibly interactive, and you're very close to like your classmates in that sense. I think like as I was saying, because because you spend so much time in the studio, you get to know your year group very well, and because the year group is really small, like it's sort of really personal in that sense, and really social. You do learn a lot from your peers, but I think one of the more interesting things that comes out of it is the establishment of a studio culture, like this shared culture and experience of what architecture is. And in our year, microwave popcorn became something really central to that culture. And that's because, like in Ritchie, there's a kitchen which the students have access to that has microwaves and kettles that you can make tea and coffee and stuff. But somebody thought it was a great idea to make microwave popcorn once, and one day I was out of studio and I came back in, and there was just popcorn sitting on my little models
Mm.
for scale or whatever. But it just kind of shows that like it's not like sitting in an engineering lecture where you could be in a hall with 350 people and not know the name of a single person. Like you do get really close with your classmates, and that does help like learning. It helps the creative process and all of that. Just more on studio culture. When we were making the table, somebody made one of the designs that we ended up making was this really long table, and of course, what we had to do was reenact the Last Supper. Um, I think we did a pretty good job, but I mean, you can let me know what you think. But yeah, so it's really personal, and it's just good fun as well. And I don't want to communicate that like all we're doing is dossing and having the crack, because like it is really intense as well. But it's incredibly rewarding. Like you spend a lot of time doing work, but at the end of the day, or at the end of a project, it's incredibly like it's so satisfying to work through a project and actually produce something, and say that you created that, you did that, that's your idea, that's an original. um, so another big aspect of architecture education is simply the act of observation. And in first year, you spend a lot of time, like a lot of your class time is actually given over to just sketching. So like we did, um, we spent time like outside of the studio as part of class time, both sort of around Richmond, excuse me, like you'd leave the studio and you go and spend an afternoon maybe sketching around Richview, or around the Belfield campus. And then we also spent time, like this picture here is from a trip that we took to the Botanic Gardens in Glasnevin, and we just spent an afternoon there sort of looking at plants and looking at cool buildings, sketching, observing, spending time with your peers and sort of learning together, and understanding the experience of being within a space. Um, Another aspect, as Hugh was saying, is actually traveling abroad. So in first semester, we also took a trip to Rome, which again, like, it's good crack to spend time with your peers. It's fun to travel, but there's also like the educational aspect of it. Like it's really important to see other cultures and to sort of experience other cities. Like I can tell you, Rome is incredibly different from Dublin. Like it's similar in lots of ways, but it's also incredibly different. And there's a wealth of building fabric in Rome as well that you can experience, and it really does inform sort of how you think about architecture, because when you see how people actually interact with buildings in the real world, it really informs your work in the studio as well. This is just another picture from that trip there. Lots of churches in Rome, they're incredibly interesting spaces, like within the city, how they can offer you sanctuary, and it's incredibly peaceful. So this, I see there was a comment in the chat about timetable. This is an example of my timetable this year. To explain it, as I was saying earlier, your 15 credits, so half of your credits are given over to Design Studio, which is in yellow on this timetable, and then the other half are given over to 3 other 5-credit modules that I have, which are like they're lecture-based modules, and they cover stuff like history, architectural history, theory, and you also do engineering and learning about the construction of buildings as well. So and they happen in lecture settings, and generally like your submissions for them, the work that you do for them will be more theoretical and like writing based. So yeah, but like as you can see, the majority of your time here is actually given over to studio. So like even though it's only 15% of your credits, it probably, like practically speaking, takes up about 70% of your time. Again, lots of work, but incredibly rewarding work at that. In terms of extracurriculars, I mean, you probably already know, but UCD has loads of student societies and clubs. I will say I found it quite hard to get involved with student societies, just because, well, for one, Richview, as Hugh was saying earlier, is sort of located about 10 minutes walk from the centre of main campus in Belfield. It's all technically part of the same campus, but like, it takes time to walk over there. I would recommend getting a bike, but that's just general advice. You can carve out time, and like it can be done. It's all about how you manage your time. But if if you don't, like I said, I found it kind of hard to get involved. There's also the Students' Union, which I did get involved with. I'm still involved with. I'm a class rep, and that's basically all about student action and standing up for your rights as a student, which, if you're interested in politics and stuff like that, like you can get involved with that outside of outside of architecture. And also this year, the school started running a broadcast. We call it a Zoom cast on Monday, Wednesday, Friday at lunchtime. And that's basically, we get people, it's called Current, and it's supposed to promote a sort of shared culture across the architecture schools in Ireland. We get different guests on speaking about current themes related to architecture, people talking about work that they're doing, and it kind of covers the fact that architecture is way more than just buildings. And if you're interested in studying architecture, want to know more about like the things that are in the discourse of architecture, I would recommend checking that out. I think Laura has a few links to share, and I think, yeah. So just to finish up, if you are interested in architecture, you think you're interested in architecture, but you're not 100% sure, I would recommend checking out some of these things. So 99% Invisible, if you don't know, is a podcast about architecture and design. It's something that I was listening to before I decided to study architecture, before I was even thinking about studying architecture, and it covers a lot of themes within architecture and design. And like, I think if you find that stuff interesting, you really thrive studying architecture. The 100-Day Studio is kind of similar to the current broadcast that we're doing, and that came about in the early days of lockdown, when the Architecture Foundation, sort of had Zoom casts essentially, and they got people on talking about different things in architecture. And I also have a link to a video. It's a film about studying architecture. I think it's from like 10 years ago, but it sort of focuses in on the culture and the studio culture that exists in an architecture school in the US. I think it's remarkably similar to sort of the stuff that we experience. So if you wanted like a more in-depth experience of what that was like, I would definitely recommend checking out that link. If Laura hasn't put it into the chat, I will do so shortly. And yeah, I suppose just to summarize, architecture is incredibly broad. Studying architecture, it doesn't just set you up to become an architect. Like ultimately, the goal of this education, the goal of this course is to turn you into a free thinker, to turn you into somebody who can come up with ideas, and those ideas don't necessarily have to be buildings, and they don't necessarily have to be built. Like I can tell you, I for one don't particularly want to go become an architect, and that's because like my interests are all over the place. Like I'd love to become a writer, or I'd love to go into photography or something like that. But the beauty about studying architecture is it gives you that freedom to do anything. It sets you up to just think about the world. And yeah, that's pretty much it for me.
Hugh, you wanted to say something?
Well, I'm just picking up, there's a couple of questions that are coming up a few times. One is about art and drawing. And I would say that we have as many people coming in who have no background in art, haven't done art as a subject, who flourish as who do. We teach the skills, and people bring different skills in with them. Some people have skills in technical drawing, some people have skills in, you might say, artistic drawing, some have neither. And within a few months, I would say, the field has really leveled out, and people find ways of working. I mean, I hope Steph might agree with that, but just...
Yeah, no, I think like from that, like you do sort of like people do come in with different backgrounds. Like I said, I studied DCG for the leaving cert, and I didn't do art, and I hadn't done an art class at all. And I actually learned a lot from people who did do art, because of the conversations that you have in studio. And equally, like I was able to help people with technical drawing skills and stuff. So as well as actually being taught a lot of the skills for technical drawing and hardline drawing and stuff like that, and sketching, like you learn a lot from what other people bring to the course as well. So it's not a requirement, but like, you know.
There's a couple of questions about life after, like what it's like to work as an architect. And I mean, I suppose the point is that's the opportunities are very varied. Depends a lot on the kind of, let's say you join a firm or join a practice. I mean, if that practice is large, is quite small, working on small scale work, then you're going to get experience which is very intimate in terms of being on site, working with the client, working with the contractor. If you're in a larger practice, it's likely you're part of a larger team, you're a smaller cog, I guess, in a bigger machine, and that also, but it has its rewards because you're working on larger projects, maybe typically. Like say the largest practice in Ireland at the moment would have something like 300 people working in it, but the bulk of practices tend to be somewhere between 5 and 20 people. Actually, they're quite small.
Yeah.
You find practices abroad.
I think it's important as well that like I was saying, it doesn't just set you up to become an architect as well. Like one of my tutors this year is actually an architectural photographer. Like she studied architecture, but you know her primary profession at the moment is photography. And you know it like I was saying, it's just incredibly broad, and it sets you up to think really.
And that's true. And we find people moving into different, I mean, it's problem solving, and it's working in teams, leading teams.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the characteristics as well, of course, you're going to be working with engineers, you're going to be working with other kinds of consultants, you're going to be working with contractors. Buildings are not made by architects alone. They're not designed by architects alone. So there's a number of questions about portfolio, which is not a requirement. I know it is in some courses, but it's not in UCD. We simply go by points. Now, separate process for mature students.
And just on that, I know there was a couple of questions here about people who maybe feel that they won't get the requirements to actually get in from the leaving cert. And is there other options as far as maybe level 5 or 6 or PLC course options available?
I don't believe that there are. I could be wrong on that, but I don't think I am. I mean, I think the main routes that we bring people in through, we have the Here and There program, obviously. We have places through that, through the CAO, and then we have the mature student entry route. We do have transfer routes as well. Sometimes, occasionally, if people are in another course, they can transfer in year. Sometimes that happens in year 2, for instance, depending on our capacity, I should say.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. And just in relation, I know you mentioned the DARE scheme. There's someone asking you just if specifically colourblindness would be a disadvantage for the architecture field. I don't know if you'd have an insight maybe into the difficulties.
I don't think so. I mean, now, as you say that, I'm without remembering who, I'm aware of architects who are colourblind. You know what I mean? Like I'm aware of it. I'm aware of architects who are blind. well, I mean, I'm not going to go down this road there, but no, but I'm aware of architects who work with all kinds of, you know, conditions, let's say. Dyslexia, common, actually, in architecture, funnily. So, no, I don't think that's an impediment.
Great, thank you. And then just sticking with the kind of entry requirements for mature students, maybe, do you get a lot of mature students in the course, and do they find it more difficult, or the process for those?
It varies. I mean, we've had up to more than 10% of the class being mature students at a certain point. It kind of, I mean, the interest goes a little bit in peaks and troughs. Right now, we have quite a lot of mature applicants. We think it's great having mature students in the class. They like the different perspectives that people bring, different experience they bring to bear. It's a long haul, I would say, for mature students. So you're going into it with your eyes open. I mean, I suppose I could put it like that, but I think you also are in a position to have a better idea about what's involved. The mature student route does involve a portfolio, but it's not a portfolio that's about showing you can. We don't look for portfolios that show you can already do it. That's not what we're looking for. We're looking for the kind of things that Steph is talking about: curiosity, interest in the built environment, you know, openness, I think,
yeah,
to knowing more.
Great, yeah. And then just, I think there was a couple of questions around asking you about physics. So like a science subject is not a entry requirement, and Hugh yourself, you wouldn't find it's very scientific based. I know you're finished with a Bachelor of Architecture,
it's not,
which might confuse people.
I mean, you could drive your interests. Like what happens in the course is, as you go up through the years, your own, let's say, your version of architecture and how you want to practice it comes more to the fore. Right now, building physics in terms of environmental modeling, say for instance, understanding how buildings perform environmentally, is a big field. So for somebody who's interested in that and has the capacity, that's something that they could definitely pursue. But it's not a core requirement.
Brilliant, yeah. And then obviously people are asking just around the third language, which is a requirement. It's just a kind of UCD entry requirement for this particular course. So unfortunately it is a requirement. So if people aren't doing a third language, I'm afraid architecture may not be feasible for you if you haven't got that particular subject. And then there's a couple of people asking about class sizes. And I suppose we do have small class sizes. Maybe Hugh, you want to expand on the advantages of having small class sizes.
Yeah. So our group, as I mentioned, I mean, we typically have an intake in the low 60s to year one, and then we actually break that down into groups of about 12. Well, it's a little bit different this year, but 12 typically being from the studio. They're taught by one or two tutors. So the idea is that you're taught in small groups. A lot of our teaching is one-to-one or small group. And we just find that again, that's quite distinct, I would say, from a lot of the university experience in other courses. It's to do with the peer-to-peer learning that Steph mentioned. It's to do with the fact that in any given design studio, everyone has a different project, actually, you know, and they all have to develop at the same time. So necessarily that involves then breaking down into smaller groups. And sometimes with those groups, we'll work as groups together on a project. Now, in the other modules, the lecture modules, in the lower years, they will tend to be the whole group of 65 is taking lectures, but that's still actually a relatively small group. Yeah, I think that answers that.
Yeah, it does. And then there was a couple of questions asking around how many places we have available for DARE. So just to say, it's two places every year for DARE, and I think 3 for here. And that's just it very rarely changes, but every so often it might. But at the moment, it's 2 for DARE, 3 for here. And I think we have time for one more question. So maybe let's see if we try to get a good one.
Trying to get a good one.
Trying to get a good one that a lot of people have asked about. I suppose maybe the difference between a course that maybe is more hands-on, more like hand drawing, hand modeling, and versus computer software. How much of that you might use?
That balance is changing, I would say, continuously. We still, and I think probably part of the reason you might be feeling that there's a lot of hand is because in year one we still put a lot of emphasis on that right now. But not so much. It's actually because there's a lot of learning bound up in doing things by hand to do with how you understand size, scale, how things go together, making models helps you understand those things. So that is a grounding. And then from year 2 onwards, and really the engagement with digital begins. There's specific classes to do with digital drawing and digital modeling, and that then increases as you move up through the program. I would say that there are architecture courses, not hugely so in Ireland, but certainly elsewhere, where the emphasis on the digital kicks in sooner. But I think we still feel that the thing that you learn by doing things by hand are very, very important if you're working as an architect.